welcome back to the Brand Bites podcast and our Challenges of a CMO series. And right now we're talking about expectations versus reality. And I want to start with you, Tina, because I think the pitch process is where expectations are often set between an agency and a client. And I would love to know, what percentage of the time do you think that those expectations that we are setting in the pitch process are delivered upon? How often do we get that bang on?
I think historically, there's been quite a few stats in the past that say 50% of pitch work was run, which is an appalling waste of sort of time and money. I actually think, and I hate to reference everything about the COVID years, but I think since then, the majority of projects, pitches I've been in, the work has run, which is absolutely brilliant because of speed, speed to market, business challenge. We need to get out there to respond. We've got X number budget that we discussed, earlier in terms of we need to make sure we maximise our budget investments. So for me, the last few years, say post-COVID, I would say probably 90% of pitches I've been involved in, and I have been involved in more than a couple, in case you think, she's only done two, have run, which is absolutely brilliant to see.
Mm. And coming to you, Helen, talking about not necessarily just the pitch process, but the strategic process and ultimately how that steers the brief. How do you deal with work where the work just doesn't quite meet the strategy, or whether that's subjective and you need to navigate that? How do you deal with that?
I think that can happen for different reasons. So I think the reasons that we work with agencies is to really push our thinking, to really use their expertise to produce better work. So often if the work comes back and it's not as expected, sometimes that can be a really good thing because they've pushed us out of our comfort zone and we've got better quality work. And that's always wonderful when that happens because it's sort of one of those like surprise and delight moments. There are other times when, you just need to get some work out really quickly. I think, again, that can go against sort of the essence of an agency because they want to do the strategic thinking and they want to take their time to produce it. And that's when I think it can become a bit more challenging because you feel like you're asking for something that they won't want to deliver. And therefore, I think it doesn't quite satisfy either of you. But there has also been times when, the work might just not feel right for the brand. And that's when I think it gets a little bit more tricky because I think, what feels right as the client, you're not quite sure, therefore, that the brief has been understood, but you want to sort of help shape it as fast as you can. And I think you have to be really careful, don't you? I always feel like when work's presented and if it's not quite right, you never really want to upset the team that's presented it, but also you've got to ensure that you're protecting the brand and getting it out in the right way. And I think that comes down to relationships. I think if you can build longer, really solid relationships, you can be really honest and open. But if it's a newer relationship, that can be more challenging because I think you don't want to upset the team that's presented their work, but you also really want to protect the brand. And I think we do that then by really immersing the teams that work on the brands, around what's really important, the heritage, the stories behind it, what we've done before, the learnings that we've taken, so that people really get to understand the kind of the brand essence, really.
Yeah, I think it's really important that I think an agency invests that time in understanding that brand. So, they understand where you've come from, but then can add some value on where they're going to work with you to get you to, kind of thing. And I think a big part of what an agency, the expectations from an agency, as far as I'm concerned, is that we have to challenge that thinking. We have to understand the brief, deliver on what has been asked, but make sure that we're offering something new and different or another perspective, not just the other perspective. Because if you're not seeing what you had hoped, then you got to be taken along that journey, really. And I think often agencies can get a little excited about this big shiny thing over here that you haven't asked for, and perhaps not investing in the thing that really you just need, and then we'll get onto that kind of thing as well. So back to the kind of the question of during that process of pitch and awarding an agency, and then that kind of fulfillment of whatever the project may be, and on that kind of subject of I guess accountability, how involved are procurement at post that process? I've probably experienced mixed. Sometimes you never see them again. Other times you're meeting them fairly frequently.
I think it depends on the level of expertise and the marketing. I mean, the answer is yes, they should be involved, but I think it depends on their expertise. And I'm seeing a slightly worrying trend that marketing procurement people, because I think, I would think it's the best category out of all procurement, to buy. But I am seeing that there are some marketing people that have now got IT and HR to buy, and that's starting to dilute their knowledge. Limited pressure on resource, as any, both from a marketing and from an agency point of view. And I know, one of your clients, for example, you had a team of 10, they're now a team of 3 marketing procurement people. So you then have to prioritise. Sometimes they have thresholds where they get involved. So I've got a global client in the States, only gets involved in things that are over $3 million, for example. So I think good marketing procurement people, subject to resource, time, expertise, totally and utterly are that business partner throughout the whole process. Because I think, as we said, longevity, investment in partnerships, is a partnership, as opposed to a supplier relationship. Do a brilliant job in having things like quarterly business reviews and commercial reviews, etc. And I think they're worth their weight in gold, and I love them when they're two-way feedback and stuff like that. But there's just a number of factors, as always, with challenges on resource. But no, a good marketing procurement person will be standing alongside their stakeholders and their agencies and managing that dialogue on a frequent basis.
Yeah.
I think a quarterly business review is really powerful, because I think it can help the client understand whether the agency is delivering against, the objectives in the offering. But it can also help the agency, because I think often, like, the client can overbrief. Suddenly you've agreed 5 strategic projects, but we've asked for 7. And I think it can keep both sides really focused on what was, the scope, and did we both deliver against that. And I think it's like a great moment in the process to just stop and reflect and talk about how it's going and ways of working and what can each side do to improve. And I think whilst the relationships are close, sometimes we don't know that the excess work that we've asked for has put the agency under a lot of pressure from a cost perspective, or we might have asked for a certain tool or something and that's not yet been delivered, and therefore we're not delivering against our business objectives. So I think QBRs are a really beneficial part of the whole process. Yeah,
and between the kind of procurement, marketing, and agency, it's that opportunity to have that objective conversation, open a door to have a difficult conversation. Equally, celebrate the successes, and kind of long may it continue. So I think it's good to have those, definitely.
I don't think we do enough celebrating.
No, true.
I think it's interesting. We're
not excessive celebrating, obviously.
A lot of people talk about awards and things, don't we? We're talking about that, but. I think maybe because it's marketeers, like, we always want to do more, do better, build something even more impactful. And
taking a moment.
I think so.
We're probably guilty of not doing often enough, particularly at the pace that we were talking about earlier. You're straight on to the next thing, and it's important just to reflect and think about what you've learned and what you've achieved. So.
Yeah.
I think it comes down to setting expectations early on, right? Because when we've talked a little bit about QBRs, etc., and I think from an agency perspective, you start to panic when procurement appear, and having not been introduced to procurement early on.
Yeah.
And in fact, a lot of this, a lot of the benefit comes from when it's a 3-way conversation right at the beginning, because that helps us to determine, what success does look like early on, and how do we make sure that we are staying on track in budget, etc. We talked a little bit about innovation off camera as well, and I'm curious to know, how do you set the expectation that it's okay to try some different things, and it's not necessarily always important that every single piece of work delivers if it's going to advance the advance the marketing functions? How do you set that expectation?
I mean, I think if you don't try something new in our industry, then you're missing out on massive opportunities, aren't you? Like when I was at Boots, we would put 10% of our budget aside to try new channels, new innovation, and it wouldn't matter if it failed. I mean, some of the teams still were like, oh, it's got to work. But like, it doesn't have to. Like, we used to do a share and learn session. And I mean, it wasn't just for the new things we tried. We would encourage it on all of the projects that we did. But I think having that opportunity to test, like the new, like we did all sorts of stuff, you know, we launched some beauty awards on TikTok. We'd never done that before. You know, like we did all sorts of different things. And I think it enables you to grow, to learn the channels better, the innovation that's out there. So I would really encourage people to always put some budget aside to test and learn new things.
Yeah, and I think clients don't do that enough. I think you have to be brave and you have to take risks, but you have to balance that with the maximising the marketing budget you've got. So, you know, like Helen said, I've seen some clients say, well, just put 10% aside and no pressure, let's have a play and see what there is. But then sales are down, we need to, you know, okay, what happens to that 10% then gets given and right, let's invest in X and Y. So it's a really tricky one, I think, you know, with the pressures on marketing budgets and making the work that works. I think it is really hard to try and protect that 10%. And it's, you know, it's brilliant that the marketeers do try and do that, because I think definitely, and we would support that from a procurement point of view, is because you don't, you know, you've got to take a bit of risk and, you know, risk and reward. Yeah,
and you still put a lot of rigour into that 10%, even though it's test and learn, you know, to give it the best possible chance. And I think one of the benefits of the way we work today is that some of the activity you do, you can almost get immediate results, can't you? You can look at it daily in certain channels, and therefore you can tweak and adapt and optimise as you go. So it's a rare moment that something doesn't return, really.
And as you are doing this test and learn, and also, you know, what we talked about in our previous discussion about the expanding role of content across different channels, and we talked a little bit about consistency, but I mean, how do you make sure that you are consistent when you are globalizing content, when you're localizing content, when you're personalizing and trying new things?
I honestly think that's one of the most challenging elements. I think the more channels, the more messages, the more categories, the different teams that work on it, to get the brand consistency just becomes more and more difficult. And you try and do some of the, you know, like old school elements where you've, you know, what's the role of the logo, what's the colour, the font, but the reality is, I think there's a risk of the more teams that touch something and they try to make the work their own, it sort of changes. And I still think there's power to looking at the work alongside, you know, look at all the channels. If you're doing a big campaign, I think there's power in looking at all of the channels alongside each other, you know, the creative execution of it, just to see if it has got that red thread through it.
We often, with the global clients, tend to have, you know, whether it's a monthly or a quarterly sort of, you know, town hall with the client and the agencies and the internal teams, and it's that whether it's kind of physically put up on a wall or that virtual wall of, you know, here's what everybody's doing, just to kind of revisit those perimeters within which we're all working to here, because you know, the brand guidelines kind of, everybody invests in understanding that straight off, but it does evolve, and brands do evolve over time, and it's important that they do, but it's about you making sure that you take those opportunities to just get everybody back in together and say, right, you know, where do we feel comfortable pushing it, where do we feel less comfortable pushing it, and making sure we're all kind of collaborating, you know, in the room at the same time at some point in time. And like I say, I think that kind of, particularly from a global business, is really important that you know the time is taken to do that.
And for me, it really starts at the beginning of a project, and it is about that designing the right agency model that's fit for the future. And I've had a number of projects, especially over the last few years, that are global, and it's been really difficult to say, okay, you want to centralise So you're going to look at it globally. So you want to be a Nike or a Coke, and we've all seen those ads on TV. You think, yeah, that's an ad made in Europe, isn't it? And like with dubbing and stuff like that. But they do it really well, and that suits those big clients. But for me, it's where does the budget lie, and where does the power lie, and that makes all the difference with my clients that have got success in doing that. I hate the word local, but it does work. But you do need that centralised ownership at a certain level and budget. And then from that, you then agree, okay, what are the universal themes and what degree of local adaptation can you have? So we know it can be done because we've seen, the big guys do it all the time, sometimes successfully, Coke, Christmas ads, for example, sometimes unsuccessfully. But for me, time and time again, when I'm designing global agency models, it's where does the budget sit and where does the power sit? So Coke, when they did their sort of globalisation a few years ago, the CMO was very clear, this is the structure that I'm having. And, and then they appoint WPP and have got the OpenX model. So, that doesn't work for every client, does it? Because then you've got, regional and then you've got local. But it all starts with where does the budget lie in the CMO, and then having the brand guidelines and agreeing the universal themes of local adaptation.
I think for me, it's really important to listen to the local teams as well. Like they know the customer, they know the language, like the skincare is a great example where you might talk about slightly different words to describe efficacy in different countries. So I think learning from the local teams and being prepared to listen and adapt whilst retaining sort of, elements of the master asset. But also there's these amazing workflow tools, aren't there now, where you can put in a master asset and it will adapt for different languages, different pricing, different, customer imagery. So, there's that's the other thing that I think is important as marketers for us to lift our heads and also always see what technology is out there to enable the work to be done as effectively, but almost with ease, so see what tools are available for us. And obviously our procurement teams would then help us source those.
Cool. And I'm going to throw a question out that's not on the card as well, because we're talking a lot about globalization, localization, and the increasing complexity. When you are working with or briefing an agency partner that you have in market in 10 markets and they're looking after 10 channels in each of those 10 markets, how do you approach those conversations where not every single one of those 100 touch points is working the way that it should? How do you prioritize that kind of conversation?
That's a tricky one, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think also it can be really different. So when I was in a global role with local teams, my local team would take it to their sort of agency and work directly with them. So it might have been different teams that adapted it. But, we had such an incredible local team that they really understood what were the important elements. I think it can be challenging because I think often agencies will have different teams in different countries. So even though they're the same name above the door, they're often different people working in different ways, aren't they? And that's where I think you do sort of resort back to the brand Bible, the BVI, the assets that are important to sort of translate through. And then I think if you've got an area that's not working, that's where it's really important, isn't it, to build those relationships, understand maybe why they're doing it differently, and understand because probably they're doing it that way because that's what's right for their customer. And I think it's really important, I think, if you're in a global, local working role, that you really do understand the markets. And it's hard to do that if you don't visit that market, you don't understand it. It's one of the most challenging elements, I think, and of all of the roles that I've done is cracking that.
For me, it's always about communication. That for me is a mantra in life anyway. And I do think you can never not over communicate, and agreeing roles and responsibilities and being clear as to what that is. And I think, as Helen said, having an empathy for what's happening locally, and their budgets can be very different and challenging. I've seen some countries where marketing budget, say, is 100 grand for the whole year, for example, compared to the centre where it's 5 million or 10 million, for example. So I think it's having communication, isn't it? And that is a two-way street. And I think, as Helen said earlier as well, using tech. Yeah. I think, agencies are very good at using tech, be it on workflow and stuff like that. And I think we could all be a bit better with that. And obviously, we get onto it when we talk about AI, but definitely with workflow tools, and things like I said in the first point about reusing, repurposing, and looking at those sort of ways of working. So, but it's communication and agreeing the roles and responsibilities of global, regional, local, and and they do need some degree of authority, and it's just understanding what that is. And making sure from a procurement point of view, you've got the right supply model in place, because, there's always been I never used to buy PCs, but it's always like, well, I can go down to Curry's and get it a lot cheaper. So why can't I do that when I'm in, country X, and you want me to use, a centralised London-based, Manchester-based, New York-based agency? This is 3 times the cost. So procurement's always to make sure they listen as well, and make sure you get the right agency model in place that can work across the markets if you're looking, say, at a sole supply arrangement.
I think the talking about roles and responsibilities, the responsibility of the agency is also to be that connection with those local marketing teams with the central or the global team, really, because you've got to be that guardian, if you like, often, and because whilst local teams are doing things for the very best intentions, sometimes there is perhaps the message hasn't quite landed, that as an agency you do need to kind of go, well, actually, if we do stretch into this area, it is going to maybe contradict what's happening here on a global level, and here's an alternative point of view. So I think, to your point around roles, responsibilities, communication, that gives you the best chance anyway.
We've just started touching on tech a little bit, so I think that's a good place to leave it and pick up the role of technology in our next discussion. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.